Okay, then I think we will start. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody, and a very warm welcome to the third RCI pod webinar entitled Immediate and Long-Term Impact of COVID-19 on the Trade Landscape. So before we start, we would like first to do a small survey. We all know that these webinars, they don't have the same physical presence as a real meeting, but at the same time, we have the advantage of doing things like, for example, this survey. So Mara, can you maybe upload the screen with the QR code? So you will see a QR code that you can scan, but also Mara, she put a link in the meeting chat that you can use and click, and then you will see two questions that appear. The first question is, what do you think is the biggest risk to trade? And you can click actually several answers. And the second question is, by how much will global trade plunge in 2020? You have about 15 minutes to answer those simple questions, and we will look at the results of this survey during our webinar. So let me now start with the webinar. We're coming together today at the moment when the global COVID-19 pandemic is spreading at the highest speed. Yesterday, the WHO reported a record number of over 183,000 new cases. While most of them are in North and South America, Asia is, of course, also suffering a lot. Actually, those who are not presenters, could you switch off the camera? Ms. Stevenson, please. Thank you. So this COVID-19 pandemic has caused one of the severest economic contractions ever recorded. Public health interventions to stem the spread of the virus and also the fear among economic agents has led to a sharp contraction of both demand and supply. What the IMF calls now the Great Lockdown is having profound consequences on international trade in the short and long run. In the short run, many of the regional and global supply chains have been interrupted or even fallen apart and need to be reconstructed. The pandemic is also severely affecting the transportation of goods and services. According to the latest edition of The Economist magazine, around 250,000 seamen and women, many of them from India, Indonesia, and Philippines, are now stranded at sea and are forbidden to disembark. When it comes to tourism, the number of international tourist arrivals have fallen by 51% from January to April in Asia, according to the UN WTO. But at the same time, we know that trade is very essential to fight the pandemic across the globe. During the critical phase of the outbreak, Europe and the US have been able to import millions of masks and other personal protective equipment from different Asian economies that were actually recovering from their initial outbreaks and lockdowns. In the long run, the current crisis may cause a reshoring of economic activities. Thierry Breton, he's the European Commissioner for the Internal Market, has expressed the view that globalization has gone too far and has said that I'm convinced that our relationship with the world after this crisis will be different. So there is a risk of a reshoring, which will undermine the economic prospects of many developing countries, especially here in the region. It will also make products and services more expensive, and the gains in terms of higher resilience are more than questionable, in my opinion. So the purpose of this webinar is to better understand the short and long-term consequences of the current pandemic on international trade and trade policy. I have the honor to moderate the discussion today. We have a group of very distinguished speakers. I will only introduce them to you briefly. You also find their detailed bios in the document that was sent attached to the invitation to this seminar. So we will start with a short presentation of recent work done by ERCI and then move to the panel discussion. So let me first start with Mr. James Villafuerte. James is a senior economist in ERCI. He has made a distinguished career in ADB after having worked for the Department of Treasury and Finance of Victoria, Australia, and also as an economist in the World Bank office in Manila. So James will present the latest ADB forecast on the trade impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. James, the floor is yours. And I
Thank
think
you, Matthias. Good morning, everyone. 6 weeks ago, the ADB published its third COVID-19 economic impact assessment. And what I will discuss today is the trade analysis of that study. Next slide, please. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to spread around the world. And as Matthias said, I think the recent number is that there are about over 9 million infections with about over 470,000 deaths. When we did the study in May, middle of May, the number of recorded infections were only 4 million and the recorded deaths were only 235,000. That's why it's very important that we continue to do the analysis in terms of the COVID-19 impact on the various dimensions of the global economy. And I think the trade dimension is a very important transmission mechanism. Next slide, please. Before I start, let me just recap the macroeconomic results of the May 15 ADB assessment because that provides a good backdrop for the effects on trade. As Matthias said, IMF in April downgraded its forecast of global growth by 6.3% to 3% and called this pandemic the greatest lockdown. A few weeks ago, the World Bank also published its global growth forecast through its global economic prospects, and their World Bank downgraded its forecast by 7.2% to 5.2%. So you can just imagine the massive impact that COVID-19 has brought to the global economy. For the ADB analysis in May, what we found out is that our initial estimate of 2 trillion in the short containment to 4.1 trillion in the long containment economic impact has actually been more than doubled to 5.8 trillion in the short containment to 8.8 trillion in the long containment, or equivalent to 6.4% to 9.7% of global GDP. So if you compare the downgrade of the IMF and the World Bank, ours is within the ballpark, and actually on the long containment, our estimate is actually larger. Globally, the impact of COVID-19 on labor market has also been very deep. We know that, for instance, the ILO said that almost 80% of the global workforce, equivalent to 2.7 billion, has been actually affected by the lockdown. In its estimate in April, the ILO has estimated around 200 million full-time job cuts. For our study, we observed that job losses globally will range from 158 million in the short containment to 242 million in the long containment. And expected wage foregone income range from almost 1.2 trillion to 1.8 trillion. These are actually large economic losses accruing from the labor market. More than the deep labor market impact, COVID-19 has also reversed some of the development gains that we've attained since the global financial crisis. For example, in our estimates of 34 Asian developing member countries with data, in the long containment, we expect the number of poor people under the extreme poverty threshold of $1.9 a day will increase by 56 million. And for the $3.2 a day poverty threshold, it will increase by 140 million. So these numbers are actually quite large. So these are the overall macroeconomic results that are serving as a good backdrop for the trade result. Next slide, please. In our analysis, we basically looked at 3 transmission mechanisms. So the first transmission mechanism that we looked at is the increase in trade cost, and it's basically affected trade in services represented by tourism and trade in goods and services, which I will discuss now. Basically, the reason why there was an increase in trade cost is that immediately as a result of the lockdown, we saw the supply of air cargo diminish greatly. So because people's movement have been impaired, along with it, the movement of goods, in particular freight, have also been impaired. Port protocols have also changed, and this has affected the shipping of goods and services all over the world. We also observed that some countries, in particular for some of the essential commodities like PPEs, face masks, imposed export restrictions, and this has actually negatively affected the flow, the global flow of these important commodities. We have also seen the cost of air freight, they've risen, and the lockdown because of the social distancing and limited labor force also affected the trade process from trade clearance to cargo processing. Health and safety measures also affect the time and the cost of trade. Next slide, please. So for example, this is a map that shows you the extent of the reduction in the air cargo availability. So for example, if you look at the lower right hand side, you'll see a minus 48. That's actually air cargo flying from Brazil going to Australia. So it's shut down by almost 48%. If you look at the concentric arrow with a minus 22%, that's actually the air cargo ability within the intra-Asian movement. So you also have a minus 60 on the upper left arrow. That's actually the movement of air cargo from Europe going to the US and North America. And you can also see that beneath that air cargo going to Brazil has also been affected quite sharply. The estimate of total freight for 2020 is expected to diminish by around 18%. So this is just some of the numbers that we have at the backdrop. Next slide, please. This chart actually shows you the 3-month moving average of export growth of goods trade from January to April compared to a year ago. And you can see that, for example, the growth rate of China has declined by 9%, whereas the growth rate of Asia excluding China has declined by negative 7%. It's quite telling that the decline in the export growth rate for South Asia is actually the largest in the region. Next slide, please. So basically, in the baseline analysis, we assume that the iceberg cost will increase by 1% and in the short containment scenario, and will increase by 2% in the long containment scenario. So let me explain a bit what we mean by the iceberg cost. So we use the GTAP model, and in the GTAP model, there is what we call the AMS variable, which basically tells us the diminishing value of trade as it moves from the exporting country to the importing country. So if a shock is a minus 1% in iceberg cost, what it means is the value of exports that reach the destination country actually diminished by 1%. So holding export values the same, if you say there's a shock of 1%, which means that what gets into the importing country is actually much less because of changes in effective prices. So what the simulation suggests is that in the short run, in the short containment scenario, global trade will actually fall by 1.7 trillion, equivalent to almost 2% of global GDP. And in the long containment scenario, it will fall by almost 2.6 trillion, equivalent to 3% of GDP. If you look at the distribution of the global losses in trade, 45% of the global losses in trade actually accrues to Asia. 40% of the global losses in trade will accrue to G3, whereas PRC will account for around 18% of the global decline in trade. If you look at the decline in trade relative to GDP, what you will observe is that actually Southeast Asia will actually experience the largest decline in trade, ranging from minus 6.5% in the short containment scenario to minus 9.7%. This is also followed by South Asia, which will suffer a decline in trade equivalent to minus 2.8% of GDP to minus 4.1% in the long containment scenario. So what this chart tells you is that the impact on trade decline is actually larger for Asia relative to GDP. When we did this analysis, compared to the global impact to the global hit on GDP, the trade hit is roughly around 30%. So how we interpret the trade impact is this is really the spillover effect. So if you ask me of the total impact of COVID-19 on output, what's the spillover effect? Roughly, it's about 30%. So what I can see is that the trade impact of COVID is actually much less. And mainly, I think because one, most of the affected sectors actually are in services, in particular recreation, restaurants, hotels, which are not tradable. However, the other explanation is that the pandemic actually happened right after the Chinese New Year, and we know that in Asia, most of exports ramp up before the Chinese New Year. So what happened, I think, is that globally the exports actually occurred prior to Chinese New Year. So in the first 3 months of the global pandemic, I think the economic impact on trade is much less because countries still have some buffer or inventories. Next slide, please. Still in our analysis, the assumption of 1 to 2% increase in iceberg cost is actually quite on the low side. So what we did was we did a sensitivity analysis and assumed that the iceberg cost actually will increase by 2.5% in the short containment and 5% in the long containment. And if we do that, the trade impact actually increases from 1.7 trillion in the short containment to almost 2.3 trillion in the short containment, equivalent to 2.5% of GDP. And in the long containment, it increased to over 3.7 trillion, equivalent to 4% of GDP. It's quite interesting that as we increase the trade cost, the share of actually Asia diminish and the share of G3 actually increases. That's one of the impact that we've seen. But still, in the sensitivity analysis, the impact of COVID on trade is still much larger on Asia. In particular, Southeast Asia and East Asia are heavily affected, also Japan. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I think what the analysis tells us is that the COVID-19 impact is quite significant for Asia. In the long containment, it could range between 2 to 3% of global GDP. In the baseline, rather, it could range from 2 to 3% of global GDP. If we increase it to 2.5 to 5% in terms of iceberg cost, the trade impact rises to 2.5 to 4% of global GDP. And it is notable that the trade impact of COVID is larger on Asia. Within Asia, Southeast Asia and East Asia are also hard hit. One caveat for our analysis is that our analysis did not incorporate the impact of commodity prices, and we also did not cover the impact on trade services. Thank you, Matias. Back to you.
Thank you so much, James, for this very nice presentation. We have two questions that are very specific on your presentation. So if you allow,
I'll answer it on the chat. So,
or I can read them to you and you answer them, or
yeah, sure.
So one question is by Guntur. He says, can you please clarify the story behind the long containment? What is the dynamic path of this? And the second question is by Sanchita. She's asking why the decline in trade is highest in South Asia. These countries are less open compared to Southeast Asia.
Okay, thank you, Matias. On the question about the long and short run containment, the question from Guntur. Basically, our assumption is that in the short containment. Pardon? It's okay. In the short containment, the assumption is that it takes 3 months from the peak of the infection to when the infection is controlled for the effects to go into the model. I think it's and in the long containment, we assume that it takes 6 months.
You have an echo on your side, I think.
I think if everyone will mute, I think the echo will disappear. Maybe we can answer the question later. Let's continue with the presentation. Is that while we sort out the technical?
That's also fine, yes. Okay, so let's proceed. We can also take questions later on. I will give a short presentation that prepares for the following discussions. Let me share the screen. Hello, can you see this? My screen? That's the wrong presentation, I think. Oops. Oops. Joke. Slide. Can you see my screen? It's okay. Mara, could you show my presentation?
We can see your presentation earlier.
Yes. Can you see my screen now?
No. Okay, let me share.
Yeah, next slide, please. So as James has already shown, we have been able to access the latest data when it comes to export growth. Here I would just like to show you the more disaggregate data. So for 15 countries, we had actually already access to the latest export data. And we have grouped them here according to 4 subregions that we use here at ADB. And we see a kind of interesting pattern. For East Asia, and sorry, it's relatively small, we see a decline in export growth in Hong Kong and China very early on, of course, because they locked down first. And interestingly, Taipei, China at that time saw a spike, so there was some diversion of trade actually going on. And you can also see that now Japan and Korea are declining fast. Also for Mongolia, we have a rapid fall in exports. Similar for Central Asia, we only have data for Armenia and Georgia, but we see a dramatic fall. The fall is even greater for South Asia, where all the 3 countries for which we have data have shown a dramatic fall in terms of exports. South Asia, the impact has not been that big. We have even seen a spike again for Vietnam. And I guess this again shows that there was some trade diverted from China to Vietnam. Next slide, please. So I think all the governments here in the region, they are really confronted with a very hard and difficult balancing act. Because on the one hand, they want to safeguard their public health interests. At the same time, they know that an open trade regime is very important, not only for the economy itself, but has also a very important role to play to fight the pandemic. And for example, here in the Philippines, we have seen some discussions whether it would make sense to restrict the movement of healthcare workers. In the end, the government decided not to do that, and I think that was the right decision. Another balancing act that we're currently seeing is a lot of governments have taken enormous efforts to keep the private sector afloat. At the same time, of course, governments want to ensure that competition is still alive and is not getting distorted in the short run and also in the long run. Then, of course, there's a lot now, the question about increasing resilience. In increasing resilience often means to duplicate or even more than that existing supply chains. And of course, that comes at a cost. Another balancing act, in my opinion, is between starting the support for the private sector, and then also the question on how to best and when to best phase it out. So I think the governments are really in a very tough decision at the moment. Mara, can you show the next slide? Here we have a figure that shows the trade measures of all Asian economies that have been taken from January to May, and this is data from the global trade alerts, and it shows that a lot of countries have taken measures to actually restrict their exports in most cases. So you see an increase of this red bar, and this has somehow reached the highest level in March. This coincides also in most cases here in Southeast Asia and East Asia with a peak in terms of infections. Then since then it has come down, and that's actually very, very good news that a lot of countries have actually undone export restrictions and other measures that were actually hampering trade, and now the trade regime is becoming more open again. Mara, next slide, please. So looking forward, I think the current COVID-19 pandemic is, of course, having a profound impact on the trade landscape. On the one hand, it's, of course, exacerbating existing tensions that we have observed already in the past years. And we know now that also a transparent and more predictable trade regime is very important. A lot of measures are taken, so all the businesses should know which measures are taken and when they are phased out. Another important point, I think, to make is that a lot of countries have taken unilateral action. They didn't have much time and they didn't want to coordinate their efforts. But of course, as we move forward, as we move to the new normal, I think it's important to prepare together for the next crisis. Also, when we want to look at the hardest hit sectors like tourism, I think it's important to work together. And finally, when it comes to more resilient supply chains, I think it's important again to make this a regional and, if possible, a global effort, including the private sector. And this should definitely not lead to more protectionism. So that's all from my side. I would like, if there are no urgent questions about my presentation, let me see, because I also have to moderate. I think it's none. So let me ask Mara, do we have the survey answers already ready to be shown?
I can show the automatically generated charts.
That's fine, yeah, thank you. So these are the answers that we have received. So most of our respondents thought in terms of biggest risk, it's the disruption in supply chains. Second one was the overall weak global growth with 36%. And number three is a limited availability of air cargo, port facilities, etc. Number four, the global trade conflict. And number five, the export restrictions due to COVID. That's a very interesting result. So these global trade conflicts that we have seen that have really dominated the debate in trade have now, according to our view, taken the background, and now we have really this weak growth and the disruption of supply chains that dominate the biggest risks. Then let's go to the second question about how much will trade growth plunge. So overwhelming part of our replies shows a decrease by 40%, followed by 20%, and 3% think it's going to decrease by 10%. So that's a kind of a pessimistic scenario. I think that's the most pessimistic scenario that the WTO has published recently in April. But I think we're going to know more about it in about 6 months when the data is becoming available more and more. So thank you very much for participating in this survey, and I think it gave us some interesting points to start our panel discussion.